Hello again, everyone. Jo Seaman, Heritage Manager for Eastbourne Borough Council here. My first presentation of this series is titled Sleepers Under the Hill because I love the book. But it'll be exploring in a fairly brief way Saxon identity in Eastbourne. I'm very, very interested in this idea of identity and what it means, and it was going to be one of the subjects and projects we were working on throughout the year. We'll go back to it, it's not a problem. But in the meantime, I'd like to give you a brief presentation about St Anne's Road, Saxon Cemetery, and just a couple of the individuals there, and talk about what we found with them, how that actually gives us clues to their identity. Now, I am recording this at the moment in the town hall. It's a very empty town hall, but there are still external noises and there are wonderful bells. So please forgive those interruptions. I don't want to do something too formal. I didn't want to lock myself away in a studio or something like that. In fact, I'm moving around as I speak because those of you who know me know that's how I do it. It's not done from notes or anything. I'll be just talking about these wonderful finds that we've had. So let's explore it a bit more. Sleepers under the hill. I'd like to start this discussion by quoting from Beowulf. I'll read it first. Round the dead mound rode then the doughty in battle, bairns of all 12 of the chiefs of the people. More would they mourn, lament for their ruler, speak in measure, mention him with pleasure, weighed his worth and his warlike achievements, mightily commended. Now, the reason I like to start off with that is not only is it a wonderful piece of writing and a great little window into the past, a piece of Saxon writing, probably from about the 8th century, although that's debated at the moment. But it gives us, in the terms of its language, it helps us to understand that here what we're talking about is the death of Beowulf, this great leader, and the mourning going on around him. But this would have gone on in a very normal way as well when people died within the community. It shows by its language that they're just the same as us. They're talking about mourning, lamenting, in this case for their ruler. They're speaking about him. They're telling stories. They're mentioning him with pleasure. They're remembering those wonderful things that they used to do and speak about. And all that nostalgia, if you like, thinking about the past, sharing stories. And for me, that makes them seem like everyday people, not like these sort of gilded ancestors in the past. So that's where I like to start. But let's get on and talk a little bit more about the specifics. Now, between 1991 and 1998, professional excavations took place on St Anne's Hill and St Anne's Road in Eastbourne, the top of it, just to bring the site here. But that would not be the whole story. People have been finding Saxon skeletons on that hill for 150 odd years before that. During building projects, farming, people dug up skeletons. Sometimes those skeletons were buried with wonderful objects, grave goods we call them today, assemblages of objects. Others they interpreted at the time as having fallen in battle because they found daggers apparently sticking in the ribs and spears near the heads. They thought this might have even been the remnants of the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Now, as science and understanding progressed, we realised that these weren't the buried dead of a battle. They were actually communities of people who had been buried over a long period of time on this site. And between 1991 and 98, excavations took place in earnest. It says that ECAT, and just for those who don't know the area, ECAT stands for the Eastbourne College of Art and Technology, which used to stand on the site. When that site was redeveloped, the whole area was put over to, or a large part of it put over to excavation and examined. And during that time is when the wonderful discoveries of around 200 skeletons were found. It wasn't all that was found on St Anne's Hill. There are incredible Iron Age remains as well, but that will be part of a separate talk if you should want to hear about it. So at the time, main excavations were in 92, between 92 and 95, but there were later ones as well, 96 and 98. And what did they find? Well, there's the site now, and actually you can still go up to here. If you go up St Anne's Road, you'll find this College Green. It's actually now a scheduled ancient monument, and it's a piece of green space that you can go and sit and spend some time there. And I actually encourage you to do so, especially if you look, see where the arrow is pointing, down the hill towards the sea. You see the sea from there. You're actually sitting on a ridge, and it's only when you're up there you realise the topography, the layout of the land around you. Down to southeast, the view to the sea. Over to the northeast, you see across the marsh, an incredible area, which actually is those liminal areas between the marsh and the land, are where we think these people were actually settling and living. And then to the northwest there, and the west itself, you have the downs. So I like to think of these people being buried in the heart of their communities. All the riches of their community could be seen from this spot. It's a great spot for a cemetery. And this is the archaeological drawing of the excavations from 91 to 98. You can see all those beige coloured blobs are graves. The green ones we can ignore for now because they are Iron Age pits and features, fascinating though they are. And in these two areas, again, these are graves, some excavated, some unexcavated in earlier excavations. But you can see they're scattered there. We don't think there were many to the south. They probably carried on to the west and the north here, and the east as well. This was a very large cemetery at one point. I mean, we don't know how many individuals were there. Certainly, it was a large cemetery. And you can see it's clustered around this area, a blank area here. We think there was a barrow up here. I'm not sure what was going on here, a tree perhaps. And here we have a photograph of the excavations themselves. You see the graves there are of varying quality and depth, and they're not all oriented in one direction. It does change. There are groups, and there are possibly family groups, but they are scattered across this hill. There's also some evidence for structures around them, but not much. So, a little bit about burial itself. This statement, we don't bury ourselves, is pretty obvious, isn't it? But it's very important we consider this when we look at burials in archaeology. What we're looking at is the burial tableau, is the way I like to look at it, think about it. It's someone else or our community perhaps presenting us in death. So we are being represented by other people. And that's the way I believe that the Saxons were being represented. They were, for instance, they were exposed in either the grave or elsewhere before burial. And we know this from archaeological evidence from fly pupae that are found on the skeletons themselves after excavation. And these show that these flies laid their eggs whilst the person was actually exposed to the air, not underground. So being on show, being able to be seen and mourned, a visual representation of that person in death. And most appeared dressed for burial. Again, this might seem obvious, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were dressed how they would be every day. They may have been, but in some cases they appear to be wearing special items. Some of those could be curated items, older objects, maybe family objects, maybe objects that are made specifically for burial. Can't answer all the questions just now. All have been carefully arranged. Not all burials had objects buried with them. Some did, most of them did, a knife at least. But where they had been buried, they'd been carefully arranged. We'll look at that in a bit more detail as well. And with that, we have to presume a degree of ceremony to the burial, care, ceremony, ritual. But this is only part of the story. These things will help build up a picture of a person's identity, but they don't give us the full picture. It's just part of it, and that's really important to remember. So in these images here, we have a number of burials from the St Anne's site. These mostly excavated from 1997. And it shows the different presentations of the skeletons, the different treatment after death. Here we have on the left, probably I'd call the more normal sort of burial. Supine, laid out on their back, with the feet in this case crossed, but quite often just straight down, arms to the sides, uh, and in this case, objects laid around. Now, this grave does look a little short for this person. It could be that the grave was already dug and the person then used a grave that wasn't necessarily intended for them. Or it could be that actually that full laying out wasn't as important. But these ones you'll notice are all different. We have a side burial here, someone lying on their side with their legs slightly flexed and their arms flexed up towards their face, almost like they're sleeping. That's certainly how I sleep. Or here we have a crouched burial, almost a fetal position, with the legs drawn up towards the chin and the arms as well. It's a classic sort of burial that you find in prehistory, but this one is a Saxon period. And here, probably I find the most intriguing. We have this person laid out, a chap in this case, a male, with his leg brought right up on one of his legs and his hands clasped, you just see here, in front of his face, clasped together as if they were holding something. Now, there weren't any objects found in his hands when he was excavated, but it could have been something organic, a piece of food, or maybe flowers or something like that. It's an intriguing one and one that we can only speculate. Just very quickly, running through the burials in general, just to give you an idea of who was buried. You see here, the majority of people buried here were in this young to old middle adult group, 26 to 45. Now, unfortunately, I am now in this area, the mature adult, which there are quite a few of. But this is by far the majority of individuals belong to this subclass. And what we do find is this undetermined probably lies in this region, actually, to be honest. Children's bodies and skeletons are very difficult to age properly, and often they don't survive as well as a robust adult. So basically, I think what this data shows us is that if you made it to adulthood, you had a good chance of living to that sort of 45 age. And actually, we did have a number of individuals here who lived on probably into their 70s or even 80s. We had some quite old individuals. But it does show that the society, though, in general, is still a younger society, though slightly older. The other statistic I would just like to bring up very quickly is stature estimates. I'm always asked, were people smaller in the past? And the answer, of course, is yes and no. At some points in the past, generally the average height was lower. But we can see in the next slide here that in Eastbourne, where the average female height was 162 centimetres, the average male height 176 centimetres, that is not necessarily so, because the average female height in the UK today is 161 centimetres and male is 175.3 centimetres. So our Saxons were slightly taller. That's really an aside, but it shows you that these people, let's think of them as people, tall, robust people. Now then, let's get on to the sort of the meat of this talk, which is really about a couple of individuals and whether they're burial goods, whether they're cultural material that was left with them after death, tells us about their ethnicity, their identity, their status. This is one of my favourite burials here, ECAP 656, a female, and she was buried with a huge amount of grave goods, far more than most. And they were quite spectacular. We've got some photos in a second, but they were included this beautiful gilt headdress pin. And again, equally beautiful double dragon brooch, again gilded with garnets in its eyes. Beauty, again, I've used the term beautiful too many times here, but a stunning glass claw beaker here. Saxon people at this time are wonderful, wonderful glass makers in this area. And then an array of brooches and beads, and even here, tiny thing, gold foil from a headdress. So this is a headdress pin as well. So you can start building up a picture of someone elaborately dressed in this burial tableau. But what else do these objects tell us? Well, they tell us that this person, if we just look at objects alone, we might assume had some sort of Frankish affiliation. These two objects are classic Frankish objects, and you can find similar ones in Britain, but also in the area that the Franks occupied in southern Germany and France. But conversely, these objects here would be classed as Kentish. They were objects that were generally found in Kent. Yeah, the Franks had a great influence on Kent. So could we, by looking at this assemblage, say this woman was buried and she had some sort of Frankish or Kentish affiliation? Oh, that would be a fair assumption. But if we look at her scientific data as well, let's see if that fits in. Now, she was a female, 18 to 25, so fairly young woman. A carbon-14 dating, which gives us an idea of when she lived, was between 405 and 537 AD. The artifacts, though, because of their type, can be dated to around 500 to 550 AD. So again, we can say quite conclusively that she lived between 500 and 537 AD. Now, when we isotope test her, this is looking at the chemicals in your teeth, which can give us a geographic fingerprint of where you grew up, not where you were born, but where you grew up. She was, in fact, raised very locally. So in the Eastbourne area, the water she drank was from these chalk downs that I'm currently looking at through the town hall window. So that would suggest to us that she wasn't Frankish or Kentish, but she was actually buried, possibly in life war, objects from those areas. That was part of her cultural identity. And there she is in her grave, but with her grave goods removed. And then the photographs of the grave goods themselves. Stunning, stunning objects. But we have to be careful. We can't just look at grave goods and assume ethnicity from them. We can assume that she was rich. That could be nonsense as well. Maybe she wasn't rich at all. Maybe this is denoting her position in society. We just don't know. Maybe because she was poor, she was given objects in death. We don't know. You can make assumptions, of course. And now a brief word on ethnicity, if I can say it. 25 of our individuals were radioisotope tested. Of those, 15 were very local, meaning the actual Eastbourne area. 2 grew up within 8 kilometres. Probably that would take us up to what, sort of Alfriston area. 1 was from northwest England or Wales. 3 from the northeast England or coastal Europe. Those are a bit of an unknown. 4 were certainly from northern Europe. Northern Europe, in these terms, would mean probably the area that we now know as the Netherlands. Now, the grave goods of the identified European immigrants, if we want to call them that, were far poorer. But does that mean the individuals were poor? Certainly, my teaching at school would tell us that these people that came over from the Saxon heartlands came over and conquered the natives, conquered Britain, and they were the ones who we would expect to be buried with their spectacular grave goods. But actually, these people were either buried with nothing, or in this case, very little. And this is that individual we looked at earlier on, the one with the holding something potentially in his hands. He was just buried with very simple items. One intaglio, which is this piece, a copper piece here, and that actually would have been from a ring, but a Roman ring. So again, what does this tell us about this chap who is probably from the Netherlands? In his hand or near his hand, there was a Roman object. I like to think it's supposed to be a peacock, but I like to think it's a hoopoe. It looks much more like a hoopoe to me. But nothing else. Now, could this be that actually these people were the important ones in our society? They were incomers, and maybe they did have a lot of material wealth in life, but after death or at death, maybe that wealth was distributed amongst their people, the society around them. And we know that the Saxons loved to give gifts. And again, in Beowulf, you'll find that mentioned time and time again. Gift giving makes you a better person. So perhaps these people without objects in these cases had already given their gifts. Again, we cannot be sure. Then the other individual I'd like to look at very briefly is our Saxon warrior. I say Saxon warrior because he was buried with the accoutrements of a warrior, classic Saxon. In this case, he was buried with, this one, not so much about a warrior here, but this was a pot there buried by his head. Experiments have shown that it would have held almost a litre, so he's obviously a European, isn't he? Well, let's see. Perhaps that was for drinking beer out of, I don't know. But he was buried with, that's a shield boss, so a shield covering the lower portion of his body. An absolutely beautiful sword would have been, equivalent of very, very high status object. Some people sort of compare them to having a flash car or something. I'm not sure that's an accurate analogy, but it's a very high status object. And that you can see down here on his left side under his arm. And what do we know about him? He was male between 26 and 45. His carbon-14 dates, just as with the rich woman, came back at 405 to 537 AD. The objects put him in that bracket of 500 to 537 AD, that sort of early 6th century period. But there we go. His radioisotope testing came back that he is actually from Wales or possibly northwest England, but more likely Wales. Now, again, this goes against everything that I was taught at school. I was taught that the Saxons came into England, they beat the Britons back, the Britons fled into Wales, Cornwall, and over to Brittany. They ran away from them, they were defeated. But here we have someone who seems to be bucking the trend. And if we go by his skeleton alone, we know there are other individuals buried near him who seem to have the same sort of congenital trait in his spine, so perhaps that's his family. But here we have someone who, in death, is being represented as a warrior, and he was a big, robust individual. In life, he was a big, robust individual. But here he is in death, represented as a warrior, as a Saxon warrior. But he wouldn't be what I, in the past, would have called a Saxon. I would call him a Briton. But then these are terms that really probably had very little importance back in the past. So to finish off with, I'll come back to this statement: we don't bury ourselves. These artifacts are not just treasure or even sort of treasured objects. They're not even archaeological data on their own, although they do help us in that way. They're the evidence of human emotion, the responses to losing a loved one, a friend, a member of our society, our community, or even an enemy. There's so much more than any of these things. They do tell us about people, but it's that emotion. That emotion, can we ever find it? I think you can. I think you really can by looking and putting yourselves in their shoes. Now, the burial process in itself is often described as practical disposal, but it's more than that. It's a sort of language. It's telling us a story. It's theatre. It can be poetry. We've got to remember that. These aren't just ways of disposing of the body, although that has to be part of it. These are ways of keeping memories alive, telling stories about people, giving people identity. And it could be that we're actually looking at these Saxons and they are being buried with objects, though they're not ethnically Saxons. That is how they want to be remembered. And that is, I've got to say, how we often remember them now, isn't it? We often call these people Saxons, but they weren't ethnically Saxon at all. We're just scratching the surface of this subject. So who were the Saxons of Eastbourne? As we've seen already, just in this very short talk, they're the sum of many parts. It's partly about material and societal culture, just partly. What they're buried with can tell us a little bit about that. They're connected more through where they live. They are a community of people. By community, it's not just a group of people who've always been there. It's people coming in from outside. It's people bringing ideas, changing what our society is. Otherwise, we'd still be the same, wouldn't we? They're connected through their stories, and they tell us their stories through the way they bury people and through the objects that we find. They're telling us stories. And that the place of origin, your birthplace, is just a small part of that story. It might sometimes be an important part of that story, but we've got to remember it's just part of it. So, who were the Saxons of Eastbourne? They were all of these things, and in some ways, perhaps none of them. But all we can say is that they were here, they lived through sometimes very, very difficult times. They lived through famine and plague, they lived through war, but they lived. And that's something we really, really need to remember. They lived as only humans can live. They lived, they loved, they laughed, they hated, they argued, they squabbled, they were annoying, they were wonderful. But these were our ancestors. Thank you.